If someone had arrived just 60 seconds later, the child would have disappeared into history without a name, without a grave, without anyone left to remember that he had ever existed. The strange part wasn't that the baby was alone. The strange part was what he refused to let go of. Curled inside one tiny hand was an object so ordinary that no soldier gave it a second glance. Until years later, when that single object explained everything. One British soldier almost kept walking. He had orders, a destination, and a war that demanded every second he could spare. Yet something so quiet stopped him in the middle of a road where silence had become more unsettling than noise. That single pause would force impossible choices, uncover a story no official report ever recorded, and leave one man wondering for the rest of his life whether fate sometimes arrived wrapped in a blanket no bigger than a field pack. Long before anyone knew the child's name, before anyone understood where he had come from or why no one had returned for him, there was only the sound of wind moving through broken rooftops and one pair of careful footsteps slowing almost against their owner's will. The spring air carried the smell of damp earth after overnight rain as Sergeant Thomas Bennett adjusted the leather strap across his shoulder and followed the narrow road, leading through what had once been a quiet farming village. The fighting had already moved on. Doors hung open. Window shutters tapped gently against cracked stone walls whenever the breeze shifted. A bicycle rested beside a fence exactly where someone had left it, its front wheel slowly turning every time the wind found it. Nothing appeared hurried anymore. That was somehow worse. His platoon remained nearly 100 yards ahead, their boots crunching over loose gravel before fading around a bend lined with old chestnut trees. Thomas lengthened his stride to catch up, but something interrupted the rhythm of his steps. It wasn't a cry. It wasn't even loud enough to call a sound. It was more like a small breath carried across empty air, so faint he wondered whether exhaustion had invented it. He stopped, listened. Nothing. The breeze returned, brushing through tall grass beside the roadside ditch. Then it came again, a soft rustle, almost hidden beneath the whisper of leaves. Thomas turned his head toward an overturned baby carriage resting awkwardly beside a collapsed stone wall. One wheel still spun lazily, as if it had only recently come to rest. The blanket draped over its side stirred gently in the morning breeze. Every instinct told him to keep moving. Every order demanded it. Yet for reasons he could not explain, he stepped off the road and walked toward the carriage instead. Thomas stopped beside the carriage and lowered himself slowly, careful not to startle whatever had made that almost invisible sound. The blanket was worn but clean, tucked with the kind of care that only someone who loved the child would have taken. He reached forward with one gloved hand and gently folded back the corner of the fabric. Two wide gray eyes looked back at him without fear. The little boy could not have been more than a year old. His cheeks were pale from the cool morning air, but there were no tears on his face. He simply watched the stranger with quiet curiosity, as though he had already exhausted every cry he knew. Around his neck hung a tiny wooden cross polished smooth by countless touches. In his small fist he still clutched a silver pocket watch, far too heavy for him to hold comfortably, yet he refused to let it fall. Thomas recognized immediately that it was not a toy. Someone had placed it there on purpose. He carefully touched the child's shoulder. The boy blinked once, then wrapped his tiny fingers around the sleeve of Thomas's uniform. That simple gesture landed with unexpected weight. Behind him came the distant voice of Corporal Edward Collins, calling his name from farther down the road. The platoon had noticed he was missing. Thomas glanced toward the bend where the others had disappeared, then back at the child. Army orders were painfully clear. Civilians were to be directed toward relief stations whenever possible. The unit was not supposed to stop. Every minute mattered. Yet there was no relief station in sight, no nearby farmhouse showing signs of life, and certainly no parent running toward the carriage. Thomas rose and slowly scanned the surrounding fields. A garden gate swung gently in the breeze. Laundry still hung from a clothesline, moving softly as if waiting for someone who had simply stepped inside for a moment. Everything suggested an ordinary morning interrupted before it could finish. He searched the nearby yards, calling out in careful German that he remembered from old phrase cards. His voice disappeared into empty streets without an answer. Returning to the carriage, he noticed a neatly folded piece of cloth beneath the child. Embroidered into one corner was a single name. Anna. Nothing more. No family name. No address. Just 6 carefully stitched letters. Thomas looked once more toward the road ahead. Then, with a slow breath that felt far heavier than the child himself, he lifted the little boy into his arms, tucked the blanket securely around him, slipped the silver watch into the fold so it would not be lost, and started walking toward his waiting platoon, fully aware that every step from this moment forward might carry consequences he could not yet imagine. Corporal Edward Collins reached Thomas first, slowing to a stop with visible surprise as he looked from the child to the overturned carriage disappearing behind them. He opened his mouth as though ready to object, but the little boy quietly rested his head against Thomas's shoulder before a single word was spoken. The moment lingered just long enough to soften whatever argument had been forming. The rest of the platoon gathered nearby, boots covered with the pale dust of country roads, each man carrying the same tired expression that months of marching had etched into their faces. Lieutenant Arthur Hughes stepped forward, studying the child with calm, measured eyes. "Where did you find him?" he asked quietly. Thomas explained everything exactly as it had happened. No dramatics, no guesses, only the empty road, the abandoned carriage, the embroidered name, and the unanswered calls that disappeared in the silent fields. Hughes listened without interruption, then looked beyond the village toward the rolling farmland stretching beneath the sky, finally beginning to clear after the night's rain. "There has to be someone looking for him," he said. "Nobody leaves a child behind by choice." Those words settled heavily over the group. They all understood what they meant. Somewhere nearby, someone might be searching every road with growing desperation. Hughes made a decision that balanced duty with compassion. The platoon would continue toward the next crossroads where military relief teams had established temporary operations, but they would stop at every occupied farmhouse and every gathering of civilians along the way. They would ask questions. They would describe the child. They would not simply hand him over to paperwork unless every reasonable effort had failed. Thomas nodded with quiet relief. The little boy remained astonishingly calm, watching faces pass one after another with thoughtful curiosity instead of fear. When Collins reached into his pocket and offered a wrapped piece of peppermint candy, the child accepted it without opening the paper, turning it over carefully in both hands as though fascinated by its bright color. Several soldiers smiled for the first time that morning. As they resumed walking, Thomas noticed the silver watch slipping from beneath the blanket. He caught it before it reached the ground and finally examined it more closely. Fine scratches covered the polished case, evidence that it had traveled through many years before arriving in the tiny hands now resting against his sleeve. He pressed the release button. The cover opened with a soft click. Inside, beneath the glass protecting the faded white face, was a small photograph no larger than a postage stamp. A young woman with light hair smiled gently toward the camera while holding the very same child, only much younger. Folded behind the photograph was a thin piece of paper bearing just one sentence written in careful German script. Thomas could not read every word, but he recognized enough to understand its meaning. "Whoever finds him, please help my son." Nearly 5 miles later, the narrow country road widened into a small crossroads where several families had gathered beside wagons loaded with blankets, bread, and the few belongings they had managed to save. British engineers were repairing a damaged bridge, while military medics checked exhausted civilians one by one. Lieutenant Hughes immediately spoke with the relief officer, describing the little boy, the silver watch, and the embroidered name stitched into the cloth. No one recognized the child. An elderly woman stepped closer after overhearing the conversation. Her hands trembled as she studied the photograph inside the watch. She looked at the young woman's face for several silent seconds before shaking her head. "I've seen too many frightened mothers," she whispered in careful English. "But not this one." Thomas thanked her anyway, returning the watch to its place beneath the blanket. The child remained remarkably quiet throughout the exchange, his attention fixed instead on a small sparrow hopping across the muddy ground in search of crumbs. When the bird fluttered into the air, the boy laughed softly for the first time. The sound stopped several nearby civilians in their tracks. It was such an ordinary laugh that it seemed almost impossible in a place where every face carried the weight of uncertainty. One of the British medics approached carrying a tin cup filled with warm milk. Thomas accepted it carefully and held the cup while the little boy drank with both hands wrapped around the rim. He did not rush. He drank as though someone had taught him good manners long before the world had fallen apart around him. The medic quietly examined him afterward, checking his breathing, his hands, and the small scrape on one knee. "He is tired," the doctor said. "Hungry, but stronger than he looks. Someone has cared for him very well until recently." Those words stayed with Thomas. This child had not been wandering alone for days. Whatever had happened must have happened suddenly. As the platoon prepared to move again, Hughes unfolded a military map across the hood of a transport truck. Local volunteers pointed toward several villages where civilians had fled during the previous week. One name surfaced more than once. A church on a wooded hill had become a temporary shelter for mothers, children, and elderly families waiting for relief convoys. It lay less than 7 miles away. Thomas looked down at the sleeping boy, now resting peacefully against his chest, one tiny hand still holding the edge of his uniform. Somewhere beyond those hills, perhaps only a few miles away, there might be a woman waking every morning believing she had already lost everything worth finding. Without another word, Hughes folded the map, looked at Thomas, and quietly changed the platoon's route. Their official destination could wait a little longer. Some orders, he believed, deserved to be measured not only by military necessity, but also by simple human decency. The road toward the wooded hill climbed gently through fields where fresh spring grass had begun pushing through the scars left by a long winter. Birds had returned before people had found the courage to return, and their songs drifted through the cool afternoon air with a quiet confidence that life was beginning again. Thomas adjusted the little boy higher against his shoulder as the child fell asleep, his breathing slow and even, his tiny hand still wrapped around the edge of the silver watch hidden beneath the blanket. Every few minutes, Thomas glanced down, almost expecting the peaceful moment to disappear. Instead, the boy remained completely at ease, as though he had decided that this unfamiliar soldier was safe. Several miles away, another journey had already begun. Anna Weiss stumbled along a narrow woodland path with dust on her coat and exhaustion written across every movement. She had awakened that morning inside the basement of a farmhouse where neighbors had carried her after the previous night's confusion. The moment she opened her eyes, only one question mattered. Her son. She barely listened as frightened voices tried to explain what little they knew. Someone remembered seeing an abandoned baby carriage near the old village road. Someone else believed relief workers had passed through at sunrise. No one could tell her what had happened after that. She thanked them with a trembling smile and left before anyone could stop her. Every crossroads became another impossible choice. Every passing wagon carried faces she searched one by one, hoping to recognize impossible miracles. Whenever she met families moving in the opposite direction, she held out the small matching blanket she had kept folded beneath her arm, asking whether anyone had seen a little boy wrapped in cloth stitched with the same careful thread. Most answered with gentle apologies. A few simply lowered their eyes, unable to offer hope they did not possess. By late afternoon, the church bell echoed faintly across the hills, carried by the wind. Thomas heard it first and looked toward the trees where the stone tower rose above fresh green branches. Lieutenant Hughes smiled quietly. "If people are gathering anywhere, they will gather there," he said. As the platoon approached the hill, villagers began arriving from every direction, each carrying stories, questions, and fading hope. Thomas noticed something else as well. Nearly every mother who entered the church courtyard paused for just a heartbeat whenever she saw the child in his arms. Their eyes lingered with recognition that quickly dissolved into disappointment. Each one realized he was not the child they were searching for. Thomas felt the weight of that silent pattern settle inside him. Somewhere among these weary travelers, one pair of eyes had not yet arrived, and he could not shake the feeling that they were drawing closer with every passing mile. The church courtyard filled slowly as the afternoon light softened into shades of gold, each arriving family carrying hope that seemed lighter than the bags resting on their shoulders. Volunteers moved quietly between wooden benches, offering warm soup, fresh water, and directions to anyone searching for missing relatives. Thomas stood near the old stone in trance with the little boy asleep against his chest, careful not to wake him as people stopped to ask whether he had learned the child's name. Each answer remained the same. Not yet. The embroidered cloth, the silver watch, the photograph. Those were the only clues they possessed. Lieutenant Hughes spoke with the parish priest, while Corporal Collins checked every list of newly arrived civilians. None contained a woman named Anna Weiss. As another hour slipped by, Thomas began to wonder whether they had reached the wrong place after all. Then the sound of hurried footsteps echoed across the courtyard. A young woman appeared at the gate, breathing hard after what looked like miles of determined walking. Dust covered the hem of her coat, and strands of light hair had escaped beneath her scarf, but her eyes never paused to rest. They searched every face with quiet desperation, moving from one family to another before settling on the child, sleeping peacefully in Thomas's arms. She froze. For one suspended moment, neither of them moved. Thomas looked down as the little boy slowly opened his eyes, blinking against the afternoon sunlight. Almost instantly, his expression changed. A smile spread across his face with unmistakable recognition, and both tiny arms reached forward before a single word was spoken. The woman covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. She whispered one name so softly that only Thomas heard it. Lucas. The child laughed and leaned toward her with complete trust. Thomas stepped forward without hesitation, gently placing the little boy into her waiting arms. She held him so carefully that it seemed she was afraid he might disappear again if she embraced him too tightly. Lucas rested his head against her shoulder exactly as though he had finally returned to the place he belonged. Around them, the courtyard fell remarkably quiet. Even strangers seemed to understand they were witnessing something too personal for applause. After several long moments, Anna looked up at Thomas. She noticed the folded blanket wrapped around her son, the silver watch tucked safely inside, and the care with which every detail had been preserved. She could not find the English word she wanted. Instead, she simply placed one trembling hand over her heart and lowered her head with profound gratitude. Thomas answered with a gentle smile and a small nod. No translation was necessary. In that silent exchange, two people who had once stood on opposite sides of a terrible conflict recognized something far greater than nationality. They recognized the simple responsibility of one human being choosing not to walk away from another. The reunion spread through the small churchyard without anyone needing to raise a voice. Soldiers spoke quietly as they cleaned their equipment. Volunteers repeated the story to newly arriving families. Before sunset, nearly everyone gathered there had heard about the British sergeant who had refused to leave a lost child behind. Thomas wished they would stop talking about it. Every time someone offered praise, he answered with the same simple response. Anyone would have done the same. Yet the older parish priest smiled gently whenever he heard those words. After many years of watching people at their best and worst, he quietly understood that not everyone would have. Anna remained at the church until the medic completed one final examination of Lucas. The little boy was healthy, only tired and hungry after an unimaginably confusing day. Relief softened the lines of worry that had settled across Anna's face. Before Thomas and his platoon prepared to leave, she approached him once more, this time carrying the silver pocket watch with both hands. She opened the cover and showed him the faded photograph inside. "My husband," she said carefully in hesitant English, pointing to the man standing beside her in the tiny picture. "Before the war." Her finger then rested on the watch itself. "His father's." Thomas listened quietly as she explained that the watch had belonged to 3 generations of her family. When she realized she might lose her son during the confusion of that terrible morning, she had slipped the watch into his tiny hands along with the folded note. She believed that if a stranger found him, the photograph might remind someone that the child belonged to people who loved him deeply. Thomas closed the cover with great care and placed the watch back into Anna's hands. "It never belonged to me," he said. "I was only keeping it safe until you came." Tears gathered again in her eyes, but this time they carried relief instead of fear. She reached into the pocket of her coat and removed the bright peppermint candy that Corporal Collins had offered Lucas earlier. The little boy had never opened it. Smiling, Anna held it toward Thomas. "He wanted you to have it," she whispered. Thomas laughed softly, accepting the small wrapped candy as though it were something priceless. Around them, members of the platoon pretended to busy themselves with straps and packs, politely giving the family a moment of privacy. As the evening bell echoed across the hillside, Lieutenant Hughes called the men together. Their orders could wait no longer. Thomas adjusted the strap of his field pack, slipped the untouched peppermint into his breast pocket beside a folded letter from home, and gave one final wave. Lucas answered with a cheerful laugh, lifting his tiny hand into the air, unaware that a gesture so small would remain one of the clearest memories Thomas Bennett would carry for the rest of his life. The platoon disappeared beyond the hills before night settled completely, their figures growing smaller with every mile until they blended into the quiet countryside. Thomas did not look back often. Somehow he felt that if he turned around one more time, leaving would become much harder. The peppermint candy remained untouched inside his pocket, resting beside the folded letter from home. Whenever his hand brushed against it during the march, he found himself smiling without realizing it. Days became weeks, and the rhythm of military life slowly returned. New assignments replaced old ones. Different roads stretched ahead. Different villages waited beyond each horizon. Yet one memory refused to fade. Around evening campfires, Corporal Collins occasionally mentioned the little boy with the silver watch. The story passed naturally from one soldier to another, changing in small details each time it was told, but always ending the same way. Someone had chosen compassion when it would have been easier to keep walking. Lieutenant Hughes never corrected the stories. He only listened quietly before reminding the younger men that uniforms could identify armies, but choices revealed character. Far away, life at the church slowly found its own rhythm as well. Anna remained there for several weeks, helping prepare meals for newly arriving families and assisting the elderly whenever she could. She often noticed Lucas reaching toward every British soldier who entered the courtyard, smiling with the same open trust he had shown Thomas. The fear that had briefly entered his young life seemed to have left without leaving bitterness behind. One afternoon, the parish priest found Anna sitting beneath an old oak tree while Lucas slept beside her. She was carefully wrapping the silver watch in a fresh piece of linen before placing it inside a small wooden box. "One day," she said softly, "he will ask why this watch matters so much." The priest nodded, waiting for her to continue. She looked toward the distant road, leading over the hills where the platoon had vanished weeks earlier. "I will tell him that it reminded one stranger my son belonged to someone who loved him. And I will tell him that another stranger proved kindness does not recognize borders." The priest smiled with quiet understanding. Before closing the box, Anna added one more item beside the watch. It was the bright peppermint candy wrapper that Lucas had proudly carried all afternoon after Thomas accepted the sweet itself. She had carefully unfolded it, smoothed every crease, and kept it for a reason only a mother could fully understand. Some families preserved jewelry. Others saved letters. She chose to preserve a simple piece of paper because it marked the day her son was returned not only to her arms, but also to her faith that even after the darkest seasons, goodness could still arrive without warning, asking for nothing in return. More than 30 years passed before Thomas Bennett saw the silver watch again. By then his uniform had long since been folded away. The roads he had marched had become memories, and the peppermint wrapper had turned brittle inside an old wooden box where he kept the few belongings that mattered more with age than with value. He rarely spoke about the war. When neighbors asked, he usually smiled politely and changed the subject. Some memories asked to be carried quietly. On an ordinary autumn afternoon, a letter arrived from Germany with unfamiliar handwriting and a return address he did not recognize. Inside was a single photograph. A young man stood beside an old stone church, smiling in exactly the same gentle way Thomas remembered from a child wrapped in a faded blanket. Around the young man's neck hung the small wooden cross, and in his hand rested the silver pocket watch. Beneath the photograph was a carefully written letter. Dear Sergeant Thomas Bennett, you knew me before I was old enough to know myself. My name is Lucas Weiss. My mother told me your story every year on my birthday. She never described you as a soldier first. She always described you as the man who stopped walking. Because of that choice, I grew up with my family. I became a school teacher because she wanted me to spend my life building what others had almost lost. The watch still keeps time. The photograph inside has faded, but your kindness never has. I hope this letter finds you well, because I have spent many years hoping to thank you. Thomas read the letter twice before quietly placing it on the kitchen table. For a long moment, he simply looked through the window as late afternoon sunlight settled across the garden outside. Then he opened his old wooden box, removed the carefully folded peppermint wrapper, and smiled to himself. He finally understood why he had never thrown it away. A few months later, the two men met outside the same church where their lives had crossed decades before. There were no speeches, no reporters, and no ceremony waiting for them. Lucas introduced Thomas to his wife and young daughter, who reached for the older man's hand with the same quiet trust her father once had. Anna, now carrying silver in her hair and warmth in her smile, stood beside them with grateful eyes that needed no words. They shared coffee beneath the old oak tree, laughed about memories that had grown gentler with time, and watched another generation play beneath branches that had witnessed both sorrow and hope. Sometimes history remembers the loudest victories, yet the moments that shape the future are often the quietest ones. One man chose to stop. One mother found her son again. One little boy grew into a man who taught children that kindness could survive even the darkest chapters of history. The world did not change because someone raised his voice. It changed because someone raised his standard.